It was supposed to be a night of celebration, an evening filled with laughter and memories. Amy Becker, a dedicated elementary school teacher, had been planning a surprise 20th wedding anniversary party for her husband, Tom Becker, for months. They lived in the quiet, picturesque town of Willow Ridge, nestled in the hills of Oregon. Friends and family gathered in their backyard under string lights, toasting to the couple who seemed to have it all: a beautiful home, successful careers, and 2 teenage children, Emma and Leo. Tom was a contractor who worked across several states, often away for days or even weeks at a time. Over the years, Amy had grown used to his absences, rationalizing that his long hours were simply part of his dedication to provide for their family. Despite the frequent travels, he was deeply involved in his children's lives and cherished his family time when he was home. Tom was well known in Willow Ridge for his friendly demeanor and involvement in community projects, always lending a hand to help a neighbor or sponsor a local sports team. That evening, as the couple cut the anniversary cake, Amy's sister handed her an envelope labeled in bold, "Urgent, Confidential." The sender's name caught Amy's eye, but she quickly brushed it off as she opened the letter. What she read inside shattered her world. The letter was a notice of overdue taxes, unpaid bills for a house in a neighboring town, one she'd never heard of. Her mind raced as she read the property address, shocked to see it listed under Tom's name. A sinking feeling twisted in her stomach, but she pushed her suspicions aside, determined to keep the evening light-hearted. She would question him later, in private, without jumping to conclusions. The evening wound down, and guests began leaving, unaware of the storm brewing beneath Amy's calm exterior. Once everyone was gone, she confronted Tom in the living room, unable to hold back her anger and confusion. "Tom," she began, holding up the letter, "what is this? Why are we getting notices for a house I know nothing about?" Tom's face turned pale, his easy smile fading into a look of dread. He stammered, scrambling for an explanation, but Amy pressed harder. Desperation crept into his eyes as he admitted the truth. For the past 20 years, he had been leading a double life. He had another wife, Valerie, in the neighboring town of Clearview, only 40 miles away. Tom's work trips and late nights were, in reality, excuses to maintain his hidden second marriage. Amy staggered back, feeling as if the ground had shifted beneath her feet. The man she thought she knew better than anyone had been living a lie. Her voice trembled with betrayal as she demanded answers, but Tom's replies were evasive and defensive. He claimed he'd never meant to hurt her, insisting he loved both families equally, as if that somehow justified his deception. Unable to process the enormity of the revelation, Amy spent the night sleepless, replaying every moment of their marriage in her mind, looking for signs she might have missed. The next morning, she contacted Valerie, feeling a strange solidarity with this woman who had also been deceived. The call was brief and tense. Valerie was understandably distraught and defensive, not knowing who to trust. But within minutes, the 2 women discovered they shared not only a husband, but also identical anniversaries. Tom had married each of them on the exact same date, 2 years apart. Anger festered between them, and a bitter alliance was forged. They agreed to meet in person the following week to confront Tom together. Amy and Valerie arranged the encounter for a quiet coffee shop in Clearview, a neutral ground where they could lay out the full truth and demand an explanation. However, on the day of the meeting, Tom never showed up. The minutes stretched into hours, but there was no sign of him. Frustrated, they decided to go back to Valerie's house, hoping he might be there, trying to avoid their confrontation. When they arrived, what they found was a horrifying scene. The house's front door was ajar, and Tom lay sprawled across the living room floor, lifeless. Blood pooled around his head, and a gun lay discarded a few feet away. Amy and Valerie stared at each other in shock, their shared hatred momentarily overshadowed by the horror before them. They could hear the distant wail of sirens as neighbors called for help, drawn by the sound of gunshots. In a state of shock, the 2 women were separated by police upon their arrival and taken in for questioning. Detective Sarah Lynn, a seasoned investigator known for her attention to detail, arrived on the scene shortly after Amy and Valerie were detained. A quiet but intense figure, she scanned the living room, taking in the scattered clues and cataloging the unusual setup in her mind. The gun lying near Tom's body, the absence of forced entry, and the position of the blood spatters all suggested a confrontation rather than a random break-in. Detective Lynn was no stranger to domestic cases, but this one carried an unusual complexity. 2 wives, 1 murdered husband, and a mountain of betrayal that could provide both women men with a powerful motive. She began questioning each of them separately, hoping to unravel the tangled web that had led to Tom's death. First, she interviewed Amy, who was visibly shaken and tearful, still reeling from the previous night's revelations. Amy recounted the anniversary party, her shock upon receiving the letter, and the confrontation with Tom. Her voice broke as she described the betrayal, but she insisted she would never have hurt him, even with all the pain he'd caused. Amy admitted her anger, but claimed she'd only wanted answers, not revenge. Next, Detective Lynn turned her attention to Valerie. Valerie's demeanor was colder, a hardened edge in her voice, as she recounted her own marriage to Tom. She spoke of years of devotion and sacrifice, only to discover she'd been sharing her husband with another woman. Valerie claimed she'd been looking forward to the confrontation at the coffee shop, hoping it would give her closure. She was adamant that she hadn't touched the gun and had no knowledge of how Tom ended up dead in her living room. Despite their denials, both women remained prime suspects. Detective Lynn felt certain that either one, or perhaps even both, could have snapped under the weight of betrayal. However, without concrete evidence, she couldn't make an arrest just yet. The investigation turned to forensics. Fingerprints were found on the gun, but they were inconclusive, smudged, possibly by a hasty attempt to wipe them away. Both Amy's and Valerie's prints were all over the house, but that was unsurprising given that they had been inside together. As detectives combed through Tom's personal effects, they found a locked drawer in his home office. Breaking it open, they discovered a series of letters and photographs documenting his relationships with both women. Alongside these were bank statements revealing financial strains neither Amy nor Valerie had known about. Tom had been funneling money into a hidden account for years, an account that was nearly empty now, drained by what seemed to be an expensive habit or possibly a third hidden connection. Curious, Detective Lynn traced the funds, which led her to a third woman named Maya Burns, a cocktail waitress from a nearby town. Maya, a younger woman with striking looks, admitted that she and Tom had been romantically involved. She had known he was married, but believed he was on the verge of leaving his wife, unaware of his second family altogether. She had received regular payments from him, which he had assured her were investments in their future. Maya's admission shifted the investigation into unexpected territory. It appeared Tom's double life extended into a triple one, further complicating the case. Each of his relationships had been built on deceit and promises, and each woman had a reason to feel betrayed. As Detective Lynn dug deeper, she discovered that Tom had planned to meet Maya on the night of his death, but had cancelled at the last minute. This raised questions about who might have known of his plans, and whether the broken promise had been the final straw for someone involved. Detective Lynn arranged to interview Maya, Amy, and Valerie in succession, hoping to clarify the timeline and uncover who had the most immediate motive. She kept the specifics of Tom's financial drain and third relationship a secret, watching for any signs of recognition as she questioned the women further. Meanwhile, forensic analysts found traces of gunpowder residue on Tom's shirt cuffs, which suggested he might have held the gun at some point, perhaps attempting to defend himself. However, the trajectory of the shot pointed to an assailant standing directly over him, making self-inflicted injury unlikely. The case was filled with contradictions, and each revelation only seemed to deepen the mystery. As she sifted through the statements, Detective Lynn began to suspect that Tom's death might not have been a simple case of one woman's rage. As the investigation progressed, Detective Lynn found herself increasingly puzzled by the absence of clear evidence pointing to one specific suspect. Although each woman had a motive, the lack of forensic evidence linking either Amy or Valerie directly to the gun was frustrating. The case took on a new layer of intrigue as Detective Lynn reviewed the newly obtained phone records, which painted an unsettling picture of Tom's final moments. On the night of his death, Tom had received multiple text messages from an unknown number, urging him to meet immediately. The messages were intense and demanding, but he hadn't responded to any of them. Curious, Detective Lynn traced the number back to a burner phone purchased in a convenience store near Willow Ridge. She suspected that either Amy or Valerie might have used it to lure Tom to the house, but surveillance footage from the store showed a hooded figure with indistinguishable features, concealing their identity completely. Detective Lynn decided to re-interview both Amy and Valerie, hoping to probe their reactions about the messages. She chose a confrontational approach, presenting the burner phone discovery as if she already knew who had sent the messages. "Amy, you sent those messages, didn't you?" Trying to force Tom to come clean, Detective Lynn pressed, watching closely for a reaction. Amy looked genuinely shocked, vehemently denying any knowledge of the phone. "I would never do something like that. I wanted answers, yes, but not this way," she insisted, her eyes filling with a mix of anger and confusion. Detective Lynn shifted her attention to Valerie, who responded similarly, though her answer was accompanied by a hint of impatience. "Why would I need to force him? We already had a plan to meet together that day. I don't know anything about a burner phone," she stated firmly, unsatisfied but intrigued. Detective Lynn decided to test a hunch. She brought Maya Burns, Tom's other lover, back in for further questioning. Maya had initially presented herself as distraught over Tom's death, but now, in light of the new information, Detective Lynn wondered if Maya's relationship with Tom had become strained, especially as she might have been discovering he was not only married to one woman but two. "Maya, did you know Tom was meeting with his wives that day?" Detective Lynn asked, her tone gentle but probing. Maya's eyes darted nervously, betraying a flicker of guilt. She hesitated before finally admitting that she'd found out about Tom's double life only a few days earlier. Heartbroken and angry, she had confronted him, demanding that he choose between her and his other lives. "He told me he'd make a decision soon," Maya confessed, her voice barely a whisper. "But I never heard from him again after that." Detective Lynn noted the timing. Maya's confrontation aligned suspiciously with the arrival of the mysterious text messages. Did Maya purchase the burner phone herself, hoping to manipulate Tom into leaving his wives? Or was she driven to something even more drastic? The discovery gave Detective Lynn an unsettling theory. She began to suspect that Maya, in her desperation to keep Tom, had decided to confront him on the day of his death and had been waiting for him at Valerie's house. Given the layout of the house and the lack of forced entry, it was plausible Maya had slipped in while Valerie was away at work, using her familiarity with Tom's routine to time her visit perfectly. Later, the forensic team confirmed that traces of a distinctive red lipstick had been found on Tom's collar, a shade that neither Amy nor Valerie owned, but that Maya was known to wear regularly. This was the break Detective Lynn had been hoping for. She called Maya in once again, but this time she laid out the mounting evidence. "Maya, you weren't honest with us before. We found your lipstick on Tom's collar," Detective Lynn began, her gaze unyielding. "You were at the house that day, weren't you?" Maya's confidence wavered, her face draining of color. She hesitated, then broke down, confessing that she had indeed confronted Tom at Valerie's home, but claimed she hadn't killed him. "I only wanted to talk to him, to make him see how much he was hurting all of us," Maya sobbed. "But when he brushed me off, I couldn't take it anymore. I slapped him, yes, but I left before anything else happened." Detective Lynn pressed further. "Did you bring the gun, Maya, or was it already in the house?" Maya shook her head, insisting she had no knowledge of the gun. She claimed she'd left Tom alive, frustrated and angry, but untouched beyond the slap. Yet her inconsistencies painted a troubling picture, and Detective Lynn sensed that Maya's anger had possibly turned deadly. Without a confession or eyewitness, Detective Lynn still lacked conclusive proof, but Maya's erratic behavior and her presence at the scene left her as the prime suspect. Detective Lynn felt she was inching closer to the truth, yet the puzzle still felt incomplete. With Maya as the prime suspect, Detective Lynn felt the case was nearly closed, but a lingering detail kept gnawing at her. The burner phone used to lure Tom hadn't been directly linked to Maya, and its purchase location didn't align with her usual movements. Determined to resolve every loose end, Detective Lynn reviewed the surveillance footage from the convenience store one final time. As she scrutinized each frame, something clicked. The figure in the footage wore a distinct bracelet identical to one she had seen on Amy during the initial interviews. Detective Lynn brought Amy back in for questioning, her tone firmer this time. "Amy, I need the truth. Did you purchase the burner phone and send those messages to Tom?" Caught off guard, Amy broke under the pressure. She admitted that she had bought the burner phone, intending only to scare Tom into confessing his secrets to everyone, but she insisted she hadn't expected things to spiral into violence. "I just wanted him to feel a fraction of the betrayal he'd put us through," Amy whispered, her voice choked with remorse. Maya, upon learning of Amy's manipulation, felt a renewed anger. She had gone to the house that day because she believed Tom would be alone and willing to confront his lies. Yet, as Detective Lynn pieced it together, she realized Amy's texts and Maya's confrontation created a volatile setup, leading to a final argument that ended with a deadly outcome. In the the end, Detective Lynn concluded that while Amy's messages and Maya's confrontation escalated the situation, Tom's death was likely an unintended result of the explosive mix of betrayal and desperation. Without definitive evidence linking either woman directly to the murder weapon, the case was closed as a homicide without a clear perpetrator. The community was left shaken, the tragic tale of Tom Becker's deception a harsh reminder of the destruction secrets can bring. Amy and Valerie returned to their separate lives, forever changed, haunted by the events of that night. As for Maya, she moved away, burdened by both grief and anger, another life disrupted by Tom's lies.